At dinner my daughter clinked her glass and said, "When mom's gone we'll all be rich." They laughed. I smiled. Weeks later at the lawyer's office they leaned forward with greedy eyes. When he announced who got everything they went silent. It wasn't any of them. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The crystal wine glass chimed with a note of pure, piercing clarity, a sound that sliced through the low murmur of the dining room. It was a sound I knew well. The glasses had been a wedding gift from Robert's parents half a century ago. They had survived decades of celebrations, holidays, and quiet family dinners. Tonight, however, the sound felt less like a call to celebration and more like an alarm. I looked down the long, polished expanse of the mahogany table, past the silver candelabras dripping wax onto their holders and the floral centerpiece of lilies, whose cloying scent filled the air. My daughter Simone stood at the far end, her rose held aloft. She was 45, a sculpture of expensive tastes and curated beauty. Her silk dress was the color of champagne, her blonde hair swept into an elaborate chignon that must have cost a fortune and taken an entire afternoon. A diamond necklace, one I had given her on her 30th birthday, glittered at her throat. She looked every bit the heiress she so desperately wanted to be. "A toast," she announced, her voice resonating with a theatrical poise she had perfected over the years. My son Marcus, seated to her left, smirked into his napkin and leaned back in his chair, ready for the performance. At 42, Marcus still possessed the boyish charm that had always gotten him out of trouble, but now it was layered with the weary slickness of a man whose schemes consistently outweighed his successes. The three of us were alone in the cavernous dining room. This was a weekly ritual, one I had insisted upon after my husband Robert's passing. Sunday dinner, a time for family, but over the years it had devolved from a comforting tradition into a thinly veiled obligation. My children came not for the connection, but for the continuance of their allowances, for the assurance that the great financial ship of the Vance estate was still sailing steadily in their direction. They saw me not as their mother but as the aging, inconvenient captain they were waiting to depose. Simone's eyes, the same shade of blue as her father's, swept over the room, the oil paintings, the antique sideboard, the very air thick with the scent of old money and roast duck. Her gaze finally settled on me. There was no warmth in it, only a cool, calculating assessment. "I'd like to propose a toast," she repeated, a slight, cruel smile playing on her lips. "To the future. To a time when our family's legacy can finally be put to good use. To be revitalized." The pause was deliberate, a little piece of stagecraft for an audience of one. "When mom's gone," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur that still carried across the table, "we'll all be rich." The words hung in the air, more shocking than a shout, more obscene than a curse. Marcus let out a short, sharp chuckle, a sound of complicit agreement. He raised his own glass in a mock salute. "To the future," he echoed, his eyes gleaming with a familiar rapacious light. They drank. They clinked their glasses together, the sound tinny and false. This time, and I, Eleanor Vance, the woman whose death they were so eagerly anticipating, simply smiled. It was a serene, placid smile, one I had practiced in boardrooms and at charity galas for decades, a smile that revealed nothing and concealed everything. Inside, behind the placid facade of the aging matriarch, a mechanism of cold, hard steel clicked into its final position. For years I had held on to a sliver of hope. I had told myself their entitlement was a product of a privileged upbringing, a flaw I was partly responsible for. I had made excuses for their casual cruelty, their constant, grasping need. I had looked for the children I had raised, the ones who made me macaroni necklaces and drew clumsy pictures of our family. But they were gone, replaced by these two strangers who looked at me and saw only a dollar sign, an obstacle between them and a life of effortless luxury. Simone's toast was not a revelation. It was merely a confirmation, the final undeniable piece of evidence in a case I had been building for years. They believed my smile was one of dotage of a woman too old and frail to comprehend the monstrousness of their greed. They were wrong. My smile was one of finality. In that moment, as the last of the wine slid down their throats, I finalized a decision that had been years in the making. The game was over. They just didn't know it yet. I raised my own glass, filled with nothing but water, and inclined my head. "To family," I said, my voice soft. They thought I was a fool. They had no idea I was the executioner. Later that night, long after the hollow echoes of my children's footsteps had faded from the grand marble entryway, I found myself in the quiet solitude of Robert's study. The house was silent around me, a sleeping giant whose heart had stopped beating when my husband died. The air in the study was thick with his memory, a comforting blend of old leather paper and the faint lingering scent of the pipe tobacco he had loved. I ran my hand over the back of his high-backed leather chair, the material worn smooth by years of his presence. A glass of brandy sat untouched on the corner of the massive oak desk, its amber liquid glowing in the soft light of a single desk lamp. My gaze was fixed on the portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was Robert, painted in his prime. His eyes, the same piercing blue as Simone's, seemed to follow me, full of the intelligence, humor and unwavering strength that had been the bedrock of my life for 48 years. "Oh, Robert," I whispered into the stillness. "You wouldn't believe them. Or perhaps you would." He had seen the early signs, the seeds of their entitlement. I was the one who had made excuses. When a teenage Simone had crashed her first car, my immediate reaction was relief that she was unharmed. Robert's was anger that she hadn't even bothered to apologize to the person she'd hit. When Marcus had borrowed money from my purse to fund a high school venture that ended in disaster, I'd quietly replaced it, wanting to spare him the embarrassment. Robert had found out and made him work all summer at one of our construction sites to pay me back, a lesson Marcus had clearly forgotten. I had been the soft heart, Robert had been the firm hand. Now with him gone, their worst instincts had been allowed to fester unchecked and unchallenged. My mind drifted back, a flood of memories washing over me. I saw Robert and me in our tiny first apartment, poring over blueprints on the kitchen table, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared, electrifying dream. We had started with nothing but a small loan, and his architect's vision. I remembered the grit under my fingernails from visiting dusty work sites, the exhaustion of balancing our books late into the night, after the children were asleep. Every brick in the Vance empire had been laid with our own sweat, our own sacrifice. We built it not for the sake of wealth, but for the thrill of creation, for the security of our family, for the legacy we would leave behind. And what a legacy it had become. A portfolio of prime real estate across the state, a construction firm that was a leader in the industry, and a fortune that had grown beyond our wildest dreams. We had wanted to give our children everything we never had. We had succeeded too well. We gave them the fruits of our labor, but we had failed to teach them the value of the work itself. They saw the mansion but not the mortgage we'd struggled to pay. They saw the portfolio but not the risks we'd taken, the sleepless nights we'd endured. I looked at Robert's painted face, at the confident set of his jaw, and a profound sadness washed over me. It was a sorrow deeper than grief. I had lost my husband, and now I had to accept that I had lost my children too. Not to death, but to something far more insidious, a corrosion of the soul. They were hollow, their cores eaten away by a relentless, insatiable greed. Simone's toast wasn't just a callous joke. It was the honest expression of her heart. Marcus's chuckle wasn't just nervous laughter, it was the sound of his complete and utter agreement. My decision, the one that had solidified at the dinner table, was not born of anger or spite. I was long past that. It was born of a weary, painful clarity. It was a duty to Robert, to the life we had built, and to the principles that had guided us. Our legacy wasn't just the money, it was the integrity, the hard work, the idea that a person's worth is measured by what they build, not what they inherit. To hand all of that over to them would be to desecrate everything we had stood for. It would be like handing a masterpiece to someone who would see it only for the value of its frame. I picked up the brandy, the crystal cool, against my fingers. I didn't drink. I simply held it, the weight of it, a small solid thing in a world that had become flimsy and uncertain. "I'm sorry, my love," I murmured to the portrait, "but I have to protect it. I have to protect it from our own children." The silence that answered was not empty. It was filled with a sense of understanding, a quiet approval that I knew was only in my own mind, but which gave me the strength I needed to proceed. The following morning I woke before the sun, a habit ingrained from years of rising with Robert. The house was still cloaked in the pre-dawn gloom, the silence of the night still lingering in its halls. I bypassed my usual morning routine, and wrapping myself in a thick cashmere shawl, I made my way to the east-facing veranda. This had always been my favorite spot, a place where I could watch the world awaken, where the first rays of sun would spill over the meticulously manicured gardens, setting the dew on the rose petals alight like tiny diamonds. I settled into a wicker chair, the cool, damp air chilling my bones. But the cold I felt went deeper than the morning air. It was the icy residue of the previous night, the chill of my children's words still clinging to my soul. A wave of genuine sadness, sharp and debilitating, washed over me. It was one thing to make a decision in the righteous solitude of Robert's study. It was another to feel its emotional weight in the soft light of a new day. These were my children, the two souls I had brought into this world, the vessels of my hopes and dreams, and I was about to sever them from the legacy they believed was their birthright. Was it justice, or was it a mother's ultimate failure? The glass doors behind me slid open with a soft, familiar whisper. I didn't need to turn. I knew it was Lena. For over 30 years Lena Washington had been a constant, quiet presence in our lives. She had arrived as a young housekeeper, and over the decades she had seamlessly transitioned into the role of companion, confidant, and in the lonely years since Robert's death, my truest friend. She came to stand beside my chair, her presence a comforting warmth in the cool morning. She didn't speak. She never did in these moments. She was a woman of profound emotional intelligence, capable of reading my moods with an accuracy that my own children had never possessed. After a moment she disappeared back into the house, only to return a few minutes later. In one hand she carried a thick woolen blanket, and in the other a steaming mug of my favorite jasmine tea, the fragrant steam curling into the air like a prayer. She draped the blanket over my shoulders, her touch gentle and sure. Then she placed the warm mug into my hands, her fingers briefly clasping mine in a gesture of simple, profound support. She pulled up another wicker chair and sat beside me, her own hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. We sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching as the sky bled from inky violet to a soft pearly gray, then finally to a brilliant hopeful gold. The birds began their morning chorus, and the scent of damp earth and blooming roses filled the air. There were no words exchanged, none were needed. Lena's presence was enough. Her quiet act of care, of anticipating my needs without a single prompt, was a balm to my wounded spirit. She had witnessed it all. She had seen Simone's teenage tantrums and Marcus's youthful deceptions. She had seen them grow from spoiled children into entitled adults. She had been there for my quiet tears after their thoughtless remarks, and she had seen the way their eyes lit up not when they looked at me, but when they looked at the things I owned. She knew them, perhaps even better than I did, and she had never once overstepped, never offered an unsolicited opinion. Her loyalty was to me, absolute and unwavering. This small, sincere act of kindness, coming so soon after the galling display of greed from the night before, did not change my decision. Instead, it reinforced it with the strength of 100 convictions. It clarified the moral lines of my world. On one side were my children, who saw me as a vault to be emptied. On the other was Lena, who saw me simply as Eleanor, a woman who felt the cold and needed a blanket, who felt sorrow and needed a friend. My fortune was not just a collection of assets. It was a force, a power. In the wrong hands, it would only amplify the worst aspects of their characters, funding a life of empty materialism and perpetuating a cycle of selfishness. But in the right hands, in the hands of someone with compassion, integrity, and a deep understanding of human decency, it could be a force for good. It could build things, heal things, honor the legacy Robert and I had intended. I finally turned to Lena, the warmth of the tea seeping into my hands. "Thank you, Lena," I said, my voice thick with an emotion she would not fully understand until much later. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the rising sun. "Of course, Eleanor," she replied softly. In that moment, sitting beside the only person in the world who asked for nothing and gave everything, I felt the last of my doubts dissolve. My path was clear. It was a difficult one, but it was the right one. A few days later Marcus arrived, unannounced as usual. I was in the formal living room, a space I rarely used, with its silk-covered walls, delicate Louis XV furniture, and pristine Aubusson carpet. It felt more like a museum than a place for living. It was, however, the perfect stage for the kind of transactions Marcus specialized in, those cloaked in the language of family but driven by the engine of personal gain. He breezed in, smelling of expensive cologne in desperation, a brilliant false smile plastered on his handsome face. "Mother, you're looking wonderful today. Truly radiant." He bent to kiss the air near my cheek, a gesture so practiced and hollow it felt like a parody of affection. I inclined my head, my expression placid. "Marcus, to what do I owe the pleasure?" He began to pace the room, his movements restless and theatrical. He was a performer, and today his role was the visionary entrepreneur. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, painting a vivid, chaotic picture of his latest venture. It was, As always, a tech startup. The details were vague, a jumble of buzzwords he had likely gleaned from a magazine article. Blockchain, synergy, AI integration, disrupting the paradigm. It was a word salad of ambition, utterly devoid of substance. It's a guaranteed success, mother, a ground floor opportunity, he proclaimed, his voice ringing with manufactured passion. We're creating a new social platform that monetizes personal data through a decentralized network. It's the future. But we need to move fast. The seed funding round is closing, and I need to secure my position. I wouldn't want the family to miss out on this. I listened patiently, my hands folded in my lap. I had heard a dozen versions of this speech before. There was the ill-fated vineyard in Napa, the disastrous line of Italian leather goods, the mobile app that was supposed to revolutionize the pet-sitting industry. Each had been a guaranteed success. Each had ended with me writing a substantial check to cover the losses. When he finally paused for breath, I met his eager gaze. It sounds very ambitious, Marcus, I said, choosing my words carefully. I assume you have a business plan, financial projections, a list of the other investors who have already committed. The brilliant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the light in his eyes dimming. It was a flicker, but I saw it. The annoyance, the frustration that I would dare to apply the same business acumen to his vision that I would to any other investment. Of course, he said, waving a dismissive hand. It's all being drawn up, but this is a fast-moving space, mother. We can't get bogged down in paperwork. This is about vision. It's about trusting my instincts. Your instincts, I repeated softly, letting the words hang in the air between us. His instincts had cost the Vance estate, by my conservative estimate, somewhere in the region of $3 million over the past 15 years. I played my part, the cautious, slightly out-of-touch matriarch. Well, it's a significant amount of money you're asking for. He had named a six-figure sum, a number that was both shockingly large, and to him trivially small. I couldn't possibly commit to something like that without seeing a detailed plan. You understand, of course. Your father was always a great believer in due diligence. The mask of charm began to crack. A petulant frown creased his brow. This was not going according to his script. He was supposed to dazzle me with his jargon, charm me with his smile, and walk out with a check. My request for something as mundane as a business plan was an insult to his genius. Due diligence, he scoffed, the word dripping with disdain. This isn't one of your real estate deals, mother. This is technology. It moves at the speed of light. By the time I write a plan, the opportunity will be gone. Then perhaps it's a risk I'm not willing to take, I said, my voice gentle but firm. When you have a proper proposal, I'll be happy to look at it. The charm evaporated completely, replaced by a raw, childish anger. His face flushed. Fine, he snapped, his voice tight. Fine, I should have known. You've never had any faith in me. You and Dad, always holding me back, never seeing my potential. He turned on his heel and strode from the room without another word. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the quiet house. I sat there in the cold, perfect room, a grim sense of satisfaction settling over me. He had not only failed the test, he had revealed his true character in the process. He didn't want an investor, he wanted an open wallet. He didn't want my faith, he wanted my money. No questions asked. Test 1 failed. Utterly and completely. I made a mental note. The first domino had fallen exactly as I had predicted. The call from Simone came 2 days later. I was in the greenhouse, a glass sanctuary at the back of the estate where I cultivated my orchids. This was my refuge, a place of quiet patience and delicate beauty. The air was warm and humid, fragrant with the scent of damp soil and exotic blossoms. I was carefully misting the petals of a phalaenopsis, its flowers a cascade of pure, unblemished white, when the shrill ring of my mobile phone shattered the tranquility. I sighed, setting down the mister. I knew who it was before I even looked at the screen. Simone never called just to talk. Her calls were transactions, preludes to a request. Mother, her voice came through the line, clipped and devoid of warmth. There was no hello, no how are you. She launched directly into her agenda. I'm calling about the boutique, she said. The boutique, Simone's, was a high-end fashion store she had opened 5 years ago in the city's most expensive district. It was in essence a very expensive hobby, funded entirely by a generous startup loan from me, that had never been repaid. It was profitable but only because I also covered the exorbitant rent on the property which I owned. The fall collection is about to launch, and the store needs a complete revitalization. She continued, her voice laced with a dramatic put-upon sigh. It's looking tired, dated. We need new lighting, custom fixtures, a whole new marketing campaign, and frankly I need to go to Milan. I can't be expected to curate a world-class collection from Phoenix. I need to be there to see the trends, to meet with the designers. I listened, picturing her in her stark white office at the back of the store, probably examining her manicure as she spoke. Her plea was wrapped in the language of business, but the underlying message was clear. She wanted a vacation and a blank check to redecorate. That sounds like a significant expense, Simone, I said calmly, turning my attention back to the orchid. Of course it is, Mother. This is luxury retail. You have to spend money to make money. It's an investment in the brand. An investment, I repeated. Well, the boutique has been turning a profit for the last 2 years, according to the statements you sent me. A modest one, but a profit nonetheless. Surely you can reinvest some of those profits into these improvements. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. The very suggestion was an affront. The profits from the boutique were her personal slush fund, for shoes and lunches and trips to the spa. They were not to be sullied with something as pedestrian as business expenses. That's what I was for. Reinvest the profits, she finally sputtered, her voice incredulous. Mother, that's barely enough to cover the new light fixtures. I'm talking about a serious overhaul, a 6-figure project, plus travel expenses. I see, I said, my voice still even. And what return on that investment should the estate expect to see? The return, she said, her tone becoming sharp and icy, is the continued prestige of having a Vance-owned boutique in the city's premier shopping district. It's about maintaining our family's image. It was always about image with Simone. The perfect house, the perfect car, the perfect store, all of it a carefully constructed facade, paid for by my money. The family's image is built on a foundation of sound financial decisions. Simone, not frivolous spending. I replied, the words sharper than I intended. I'm afraid I can't approve such a large speculative expenditure at this time. I suggest you draw up a detailed budget and a plan to fund it using the boutique's existing revenue streams. The silence this time was glacial. I could feel her fury crackling through the phone. I had not just refused her, I had questioned her competence. I had treated her like an employee, not a princess. I don't have time for this, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Clearly you just don't understand. The line went dead. She had hung up on me. I placed the phone down on the potting bench and looked at the perfect white orchid. Orchids were notoriously difficult to cultivate. They required a precise balance of light, humidity and nutrients. They demanded patience. They rewarded care and attention with breathtaking beauty. Robert used to say they reminded him of our business, a delicate ecosystem that could wither and die from a single act of carelessness. My children were not gardeners. They were slash-and-burn farmers, content to take and take until the soil was depleted, then move on to the next fertile ground. Simone had failed her test just as spectacularly as her brother. Test 2 failed. The foundation of my old life was crumbling, but on the ground I was clearing, something new, something stronger was preparing to be built. After Simone's call, I did not return to my orchids. The sense of peace I found in the greenhouse had been shattered, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I walked back into the main house, my steps measured and deliberate. The sun streamed through the tall windows of the gallery, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, but I felt no warmth. I felt like a general on the eve of a battle, my strategy set, my orders ready to be given. I went directly to the study, Robert's study. In the years since his death, it had become my sanctuary, my boardroom, my command center. I sat down in his large leather chair, the one that had molded to the shape of his body over the years. It still felt too big for me, but today, I felt as though I was finally growing into it. My hand rested on the heavy black rotary phone that sat on the corner of the desk. It was an anachronism in this age of sleek mobile devices, but I had kept it for its reassuring weight, its sense of permanence. This was a call that required a certain gravitas, a call that should not be made on a flimsy piece of glass and metal. I took a single deep breath. The air tasting of old books and finality. My fingers, steady and sure, dialed the familiar number of my lawyer, Arthur Harrison. Arthur had been with Robert and me from the very beginning. He was a shrewd, discreet man, more a trusted advisor than a simple attorney. He had helped us draw up the contracts for our first building, and he had been the one to help me navigate the labyrinth of paperwork after Robert's death. He knew where every dollar was, and more importantly, he knew why every dollar had been earned. His secretary put me through immediately. Eleanor, Arthur's voice came through the line, calm and professional as always. I was wondering when you might call. Arthur, I said, my own voice low and even, devoid of the turmoil that had roiled beneath the surface for so long. It's time. There was a pause on the other end, not of surprise but of acknowledgement. Are you certain, Eleanor? Once we set this in motion, there is no going back. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, I replied. I pictured Simone's dismissive tone, Marcus's petulant anger. I heard the chilling echo of the toast. Any lingering wisp of doubt had been incinerated in the fires of their greed. Very well, he said. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as he likely opened a file, one that had been sitting dormant in his office for years, waiting for this exact moment. Finalize the paperwork we discussed, I instructed, my voice clear and unwavering. Activate the Phoenix file. The Phoenix file, he repeated, the code name we had devised years ago feeling potent and fitting on my tongue. The Phoenix, a mythical bird that burns to ashes and is reborn, stronger and more beautiful than before. That was what I was doing to the Vance legacy. I was allowing the old corrupted version to burn away, so that a new, more worthy one could rise from its ashes. I understand, Arthur said. I'll need you to come in to sign the final documents, and we'll need to set the timeline for the subsequent steps. I'll be there tomorrow morning at 10, I said, and the timeline begins immediately. It will be done, Eleanor. Thank you, Arthur, for everything. It has been my privilege, my dear, he said, a rare note of warmth in his voice. Robert would be proud of you. I gently placed the heavy receiver back into its cradle. The click it made was a sound of absolute finality. A door slamming shut on the past. I leaned back in the chair and looked up at Robert's portrait. The painted eyes seemed to hold a look of approval, of relief. A weight I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. The burden of hope, the foolish maternal hope that my children would one day change, was gone. In its place was the clean, clear certainty of my purpose. I was no longer just a mother. I was the guardian of a legacy, and I would do whatever it took to protect it. The decisive call had been made. The first move in the endgame was complete. The day after my meeting with Arthur Harrison was the first day of my new life. The life of a frail, fading matriarch. It was a role I had to inhabit completely, a performance that had to be utterly convincing. My children were not sentimental, but they were observant when it suited them. They would notice any inconsistencies, any cracks in the facade. My first prop was a cane. It was an elegant antique piece of Robert's made of polished cherry wood with a silver handle. He had used it in his final months and it had been sitting in the back of his closet ever since. I took it out, wiping the dust from the silver, and began to use it. At first it felt awkward, a foreign object in my hand. I practiced in the privacy of my room, learning to lean on it just so, to let it take a portion of my weight, to make my steady gait appear hesitant and infirm. The next time Marcus visited, I was in the library, attempting to retrieve a book from a high shelf. I made a show of reaching for it, letting out a small, frustrated sigh before noticing him in the doorway. "Oh, Marcus, dear," I said, my voice a little weaker than usual. "Could you be a love and get that for me? My old bones just don't stretch like they used to." He rolled his eyes, a gesture he barely tried to hide, and plucked the book from the shelf with ease. He dropped it onto the table beside me without a word, and then launched into a complaint about a creditor who was hounding him. He didn't ask about my health. He didn't notice the new cane leaning against my chair. He saw only his own problems, his own needs. Perfect. My next performance was for Simone. She arrived for her obligatory weekly visit, her presence filling the room with the scent of expensive perfume and impatience. I had a stack of mail on the table beside me. "Simone, darling," I began, picking up a letter from my investment firm. I squinted at it dramatically. "The print on these things gets smaller every year. Would you mind reading this for me? My eyes are so tired today." She let out an exaggerated sigh, the sound of a martyr being asked to bear one more unbearable cross. "Honestly, Mother, you should just have them email these to me. It would be so much more efficient." She snatched the letter from my hand and her eyes scanned it rapidly. She wasn't reading it to me, she was scanning it for numbers, for the bottom line, assessing the value of the account. "It's fine," she declared, tossing it back onto the table. "Standard quarterly report, everything's up 2%. Now about Matthew's tuition, I was thinking." She too had taken the bait. My feigned weakness was not a cause for their concern but a source of their irritation, a tedious chore to be managed before they could get to the real business of asking for money. It was exactly as I had predicted. The final piece of the performance was the most subtle. I began to add a slight tremor to my hands. Not always, but at key moments. When I lifted a teacup, when I signed a check for the household expenses. It was a small, almost perceptible shake, the kind that speaks of age and declining strength. Lena noticed immediately. I saw the worry in her eyes, the way she started hovering, trying to do things for me before I even asked. "Lena, I'm fine," I would tell her gently, patting her hand. "Just a bit tired." I hated deceiving her even in this small way, but it was a necessary part of the illusion. My children's reactions were different. The tremor to them was a visible symbol of my decline, a ticking clock that was moving ever faster in their favor. One afternoon I was signing a check for one of Simone's boutique suppliers, a bill she had conveniently forgotten to pay herself. As I signed my name, I let my hand shake, the signature coming out spidery and weak. Simone, watching over my shoulder, made a small, impatient clicking sound with her tongue. "Mother, perhaps you should think about giving me power of attorney," she suggested, her voice smooth as silk. "It would be so much easier, just to handle these little day-to-day things, so you don't have to worry." I looked up at her, my expression one of mild confusion. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary just yet, dear." But I saw the gleam in her eye. The tremor wasn't a sign of my frailty to her. It was an opportunity, an opening to seize control. The plan was working flawlessly. I was fading before their very eyes, becoming the weak, incompetent old woman they had always wanted me to be. And in their eagerness to believe it, they were walking blindly into the trap I had so carefully set. As the weeks passed and my performance of decline became more practiced, a predictable shift occurred in the household dynamics. The frequency of my children's visits increased dramatically. What had once been a grudging weekly obligation now became a near daily occurrence. They would appear under the guise of concern, bearing cheap bouquets of flowers from the supermarket or boxes of chocolates I never ate. "Just wanted to see how you were feeling, Mother," Marcus would say, his smile failing to reach his eyes as he surreptitiously scanned the room, his gaze lingering on a valuable painting or a piece of antique furniture. "We were just worried about you," Simone would coo, fluffing a pillow behind my head with a gesture that was meant to look caring but felt condescending. Their visits were short, perfunctory affairs. They would ask a few vague questions about my health, listen to my weak-voiced replies with feigned patience, and then quickly pivot the conversation to their own needs and desires. They were not visiting a mother, they were monitoring an investment. They were vultures, circling, waiting for the inevitable. Their concern was not for my well-being, but for the well-being of their inheritance. The most damning evidence came one late afternoon. I had retired to the library after lunch, claiming I needed to rest. I left the heavy oak door slightly ajar, a detail I knew they would overlook in their self-absorption. I settled into a wingback chair hidden from the doorway's line of sight and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Soon, I heard their hushed voices in the grand hallway. They thought I was napping, safely out of earshot. "Did you see the way her hand was shaking today?" It was Simone, her voice a sharp, excited whisper. "She could barely sign that check for the caterers." "I know," Marcus replied, his tone equally conspiratorial. "And did you hear what Dr. Miller told me on the phone? He said we need to be prepared for a gradual decline. Gradual isn't fast enough." A cold knot formed in my stomach, but I remained perfectly still, an unseen audience to their ghoulish play. "Honestly," Simone hissed, "we need to start making a plan. That art collection alone is worth a fortune, but we'll get pennies on the dollar if we don't use the right auction house. I've already made some preliminary inquiries with Sotheby's." "Sotheby's takes too high a commission," Marcus countered immediately, the pragmatism of his greed overriding any pretense of mourning. "Christie's has better rates for estate sales. And what about the beach house? I've been thinking it makes more sense for me to have it." "You've always hated the beach, Simone. You burn too easily." "Don't be ridiculous, Marcus. The beach house has a much higher resale value than the mountain cabin. We'll sell it and split the profit. I'm not letting you get away with the prized jewel of the property portfolio." "It's not the prized jewel. The penthouse apartment downtown is worth twice as much." They went on like this for several minutes, their whispers growing louder and more heated as they squabbled over the division of my assets like two spoiled children fighting over toys. They were not just planning for my death, they were liquidating my life, piece by piece before I was even gone. They spoke of my cherished possessions, paintings Robert and I had bought on our travels, homes filled with a lifetime of memories as nothing more than line items on a balance sheet. I listened, my heart turning to a solid block of ice in my chest. There was no grief in their voices, no sadness, not even a shred of respect. There was only a frenzied, competitive greed. They were dissecting my legacy before my body was even cold. Finally, Simone's voice dropped again. We need to be careful though. That housekeeper, Lena. She's always watching. She's too close to Mother. We need to make sure she doesn't have any influence. Don't worry about Lena, Marcus said with a dismissive snort. She's a servant. Once Mother is gone, she'll be the first one out the door. I'll handle it. I closed my eyes. The casual cruelty of that last statement was the final twist of the knife. They were not just content to see me gone, they were eager to erase any trace of the loyalty and love that had filled the spaces they had left vacant. When their footsteps finally receded, I sat in the silent library for a long time. The ice in my chest was not painful. It was clarifying. The performance had to continue, but my resolve was no longer just about protecting a legacy. It was now about delivering a lesson in consequences, a lesson in value, a lesson they would learn far, far too late. The vultures had revealed their nature and the trap was about to be sprung. The conversation I'd overheard in the hallway had lit a fire of urgency within me. My children's casual dismissal of Lena, their plan to cast her out like a piece of old furniture, was an insult I could not abide. Lena was the keeper of this home's heart, the silent witness to our family's history, and the only person left in my life whose motives were entirely pure. I had to ensure she was protected, not just financially but from the callousness of Simone and Marcus. I found her the next morning in the kitchen. The sun was streaming through the large windows, illuminating the warm, inviting space that had always been the true center of our home. Lena was at the large marble island, kneading dough for her famous cinnamon rolls. Her movements strong and rhythmic. The air was filled with the comforting scent of yeast and cinnamon, a smell that was more home to me than any of Simone's expensive perfumes. I walked in using my cane, my steps deliberately slow. Lena looked up immediately, her brow furrowed with the now familiar look of concern. Eleanor, you should be resting. Let me bring you your breakfast in the sunroom. Nonsense, Lena, I said, my voice soft. I wanted to see you. Sit with me for a moment. I gestured to the small breakfast nook in the corner, wiping her floured hands on her apron. She followed me, her expression puzzled. We sat opposite each other at the small wooden table. For a moment I just looked at her. I saw the fine lines around her eyes, etched there by decades of laughter and worry. I saw the strength in her hands, hands that had cooked thousands of meals, cleaned countless wounds, and offered comfort more times than I could count. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, ornate key. It was old, made of brass, with an intricate design on its head. I slid it across the table toward her. Lena looked from the key to my face, her confusion deepening. What's this, Eleanor? It's a key to a safe deposit box at the downtown bank, I explained, my voice low and serious. The box is in your name. Inside, you will find some documents and a letter of instruction from me. Her eyes widened. My name? But why? I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was warm and soft from the dough. Lena, we have known each other for a very long time. You have been more than an employee to me. You have been a sister. My voice wavered slightly, the emotion genuine and raw. Whatever happens in the coming weeks and months, I want you to know that your loyalty, your friendship will not be forgotten. You and your family will be taken care of. That is my promise to you. Tears welled in Lena's eyes. She shook her head, pulling her hand back as if the key were hot. Eleanor, you don't have to do this. I don't want anything. I just want you to be well. Her sincerity was a sharp, painful contrast to the greedy performance of my children. I know you don't, Lena, I said gently. That's why you are the only one I can trust. Please, take the key. Don't ask any more questions for now. Just keep it somewhere safe. The letter inside will explain everything when the time is right. I was not telling her the full extent of my plan, of course. I couldn't burden her with that knowledge, but I needed her to have this key, this tangible piece of my promise as an anchor in the storm that was about to break. This key was her security, her protection against the storm of Simone and Marcus's impending fury. It was the first step in transferring my trust and my legacy from those who were undeserving to the one person who was. Hesitantly she took the key. Her fingers closed around the cool brass. She looked at me, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, gratitude and a deep abiding sadness. She knew on some intuitive level that this was more than just a kind gesture. It was a farewell. "Thank you, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "No, Lena," I said, my own eyes now misty. "Thank you." We sat in silence for another moment, a silent pact of friendship and trust passing between us. Then, with a deep breath, Lena stood up, pocketed the key and returned to her dough, her movements once again strong and sure. The promise had been made, a piece of my plan was now in her hands, safe and secure. I had protected my queen and now it was time to checkmate the king and the princess. To make my feigned decline official, I needed an accomplice with unimpeachable authority. My personal physician, Dr. James Miller, was the perfect candidate. James had not only been my doctor for 30 years, but he had also been one of Robert's closest friends. They had played golf together every Saturday, and James had been a pillar of support for me in the lonely months after Robert's passing. He was a man of immense integrity, but he also possessed a theatrical streak and a deep-seated disdain for my children's avarice, which he had witnessed firsthand over the years. I had called him after my meeting with Arthur, laying out the broad strokes of my plan. After a long, thoughtful silence, he had simply said, "Eleanor, it would be my honor to assist. Consider me part of your amateur dramatic society." We arranged for him to make a house call, a rare and dramatic event in modern medicine that was sure to signal the gravity of the situation to Simone and Marcus. I instructed Lena to call them both that morning, her voice laced with genuine worry which was not hard for her to fake, and informed them that Dr. Miller was on his way, as I had taken a turn for the worse. They arrived within the hour, their cars screeching to a halt in the gravel driveway. They rushed into the house, their faces masks of practiced concern. I was already in my bedroom, propped up against a mountain of pillows, a lavender-scented cold cloth on my forehead. I had pinched my cheeks to make them pale and had practiced a shallow, labored breathing pattern. By the time they entered the room, I was the very picture of elegant frailty. "Mother," Simone gasped, rushing to my bedside. "Lena said you were unwell. What is it? What's wrong?" "We came as soon as we heard," Marcus added, hovering in the doorway, his expression a carefully calibrated blend of sorrow and filial duty. Just a dizzy spell, dears," I whispered, my voice thin and reedy. "I'm sure it's nothing." Just then, Dr. Miller arrived, his leather medical bag in hand. He was a distinguished man with a mane of white hair and a reassuring bedside manner that could calm the most anxious of patients. He greeted Simone and Marcus with a somber nod. "If you'll excuse me," he said, his voice grave, "I need to examine my patient in private." He gently but firmly ushered them out of the room, closing the bedroom door behind them. As soon as the latch clicked, the somber expression on his face vanished, replaced by a wry grin. "How was my entrance?" he whispered, setting his bag down. "Sufficiently dramatic?" "You missed your calling on the stage, James," I chuckled, my voice returning to its normal strength. I sat up, removing the cold cloth from my forehead. "Nonsense. My current audience is far more appreciative," he quipped. He opened his bag and took out his stethoscope and blood pressure cuff. "We have to make this look convincing. Let's get some vitals. Just for the record." He proceeded with a mock examination, listening to my heart, checking my reflexes, all while we conversed in low tones. He confirmed that he had spoken with Arthur Harrison and understood his role in the proceedings. He expressed his condolences for the situation, but his eyes twinkled with a shared sense of righteous conspiracy. "They are truly a piece of work, Eleanor," he murmured while wrapping the cuff around my arm. "Robert would be spinning in his grave if he knew how they were behaving." "He knows, James," I said quietly. "And he's cheering us on." After about 20 minutes, our theatrical checkup was complete. James patted my hand. "Time for my big scene," he said. He straightened his tie, his face settling back into a mask of professional gravity. "Remember, Eleanor, weak but stable, and no stress. Absolutely no stress." He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, where Simone and Marcus were pacing like caged animals. I could hear their anxious questions from my bed. "How is she, doctor? Is it serious?" I heard James let out a long, heavy sigh. "Please, let's talk in the study." The wait was agonizing. I strained to hear their conversation, but the old house's thick walls absorbed their words. All I could hear was the low, serious murmur of James's voice, and the occasional sharp interjection from Simone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the study door open and their footsteps returning down the hall. They appeared in my doorway, their faces a perfect tableau of feigned grief. Simone's eyes were glistening with unshed tears, a trick she'd perfected in her teens, and Marcus looked pale and shaken. "Oh, Mother," Simone said, her voice catching in her throat. She rushed to my bedside and took my hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Dr. Miller told us," Marcus said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "He said your health is extremely fragile. He said you need to rest to avoid any and all stress. He said," Simone added, her eyes boring into mine, "that we need to be prepared." Their performance was flawless. The concern in their eyes was so well acted, it was almost believable, but I knew what lay beneath it. It wasn't sorrow, it was triumph. The doctor, the ultimate authority, had just confirmed what they had been hoping for, what they had been waiting for. The end was officially in sight. They showered me with promises to take care of everything, to handle all my affairs, to ensure I didn't have to worry about a single thing. Their feigned concern was the most sickeningly sweet poison I had ever tasted, and I drank it down with a weak, grateful smile. A week after Dr. Miller's masterful performance, the final phase of my plan was set in motion. The arrangements had been made with the utmost discretion by Arthur Harrison. There was no fanfare, no dramatic departure. One evening, after Lena had helped me to my room and the house had settled into its nightly slumber, I simply walked out. Under the cover of darkness, Arthur picked me up at the end of the long driveway in his unassuming sedan. I carried only a single small suitcase containing a few changes of clothes, some books and a small framed photograph of Robert. As we pulled away, I looked back at the grand house, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. It had been my home for 50 years, the stage for my life's greatest joys and deepest sorrows. But tonight, I felt no sentimental attachment. I felt only the quiet, thrilling hum of liberation. We drove for several hours, leaving the familiar city lights behind, and heading north into the quiet, rolling hills of the next state. Our destination was a small, comfortable home I had secretly purchased 2 months prior through a shell corporation set up by Arthur. It was a modest, single-story house nestled in a quiet, tree-lined street in a town where no one knew the name Eleanor Vance. When we arrived, the house was warm and welcoming. Arthur had arranged for it to be furnished simply but comfortably, and the pantry was fully stocked. It was a world away from the opulent, museum-like formality of my old home. Here the furniture was meant to be used, not just admired. The rooms were filled with light, not shadows. As Arthur carried my small bag inside, I walked through the front door and took a deep breath. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. I walked to the center of the living room, my posture straight, my steps firm. I had left my cane, my role as the frail invalid in the back of Arthur's car. Here, in this anonymous little house, I was no longer a character in a play. I was simply Eleanor. "Are you sure about this, Eleanor?" Arthur asked, his voice laced with a genuine friendly concern that was a world away from the cloying performance of my children. "I'm sure, Arthur," I said, turning to him with a smile, a real one this time. "It's perfect. It's a place to be, not a place to be seen." He nodded, understanding completely. He handed me a set of keys and a new, untraceable mobile phone. "Dr. Miller and I are the only 2 people on Earth who know this address," he said. "Call me on this phone if you need anything at all. The next time you hear from my office, it will be with the news." "Thank you, Arthur, for everything," I said. "My gratitude immense." He simply tipped his hat, a gesture from a more gracious era, and left. I locked the door behind him and stood in the silent house, a profound sense of peace settling over me. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The weight of the Vance name, the burden of the estate, the suffocating presence of my children's greed, it had all been lifted. I spent the next few days in quiet contentment. I read books I had been meaning to read for years. I sat on the small back porch, drinking tea and watching the birds in the garden. I took walks around the neighborhood, an anonymous old woman enjoying the autumn sunshine. I was a ghost, invisible to the world that had defined me for so long. I thought of my children, of course. I imagined them in the big house, their concern mounting, their performance growing more frantic as my condition worsened and the narrative being fed to them by Dr. Miller. I felt a pang of sadness for them, for the love that had been so thoroughly corrupted by avarice, but the sadness was distant, like a memory from another life. My primary emotion was one of release. I was the phoenix, hidden away waiting for the news of my own demise so that I could finally truly be reborn. The call, when it came, was orchestrated by Arthur's office with cold legal precision. It was a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after my quiet departure. As instructed, a junior associate from his firm, a young woman with a calm, somber voice, was tasked with delivering the news. Simone was the first to receive the call. She was in her boutique, in the middle of a tirade, berating a young sales assistant for improperly steaming a silk blouse. The air in the pristine white store was thick with her fury. She was holding her phone about to look up a competitor's price for a handbag, when Arthur Harrison's office number flashed on the screen. Her annoyance immediately shifted to alert anticipation. "Simone Vance," she answered, her voice all business. The young associate on the other end delivered the prepared statement. "Miss Vance, I'm calling from the office of Arthur Harrison. I'm afraid I have some very sad news. Your mother, Eleanor Vance, passed away peacefully in her sleep early this morning." For a moment, Simone was silent. The phone was pressed to her ear, her knuckles white. The sales assistant watched, terrified, as a series of emotions flickered across her boss's face. First a flash of something that looked like shock, then a brief, quickly suppressed flicker of pure, unadulterated triumph. Finally, the mask of grief slammed down into place. "Oh my God," Simone whispered, her voice a perfect imitation of horrified disbelief. She sank dramatically into a nearby velvet armchair, one hand flying to her chest. "No, I can't believe it." Tears, real or manufactured, welled in her eyes. The performance had begun. The young sales assistant, taking her cue, rushed forward with a glass of water and words of comfort, all while Simone played the part of the devastated daughter to perfection. The second call was to Marcus. He was where he could often be found in the middle of a weekday, at the polished bar of an expensive downtown restaurant, trying to impress a potential investor for his latest doomed venture. He was laughing loudly at one of his own jokes, a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand when his phone buzzed. Seeing the lawyer's number, he excused himself, a confident smirk on his face, assuming it was a call about the funds he'd requested. "Marcus Vance," he said, his voice smooth and charming. The same calm, somber voice delivered the same devastating news. Marcus's reaction was different from his sister's. The confident smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a blank, stunned expression. He leaned against the bar, his knuckles resting on the cool marble. He didn't put on a show immediately. He just stared into the middle distance. The news processing, the obstacle was gone. The vault was open. After a long moment, he seemed to remember his audience. He turned back to the investor, his face now a mask of tragic sorrow. "I have to go," he said, his voice cracking convincingly. "I've just received some terrible news. My mother, she's gone." He made a show of wiping a tear from his eye, then signaled to the bartender. "A round of the best scotch for everyone," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. And in her memory, he was already spending the money. Meanwhile, miles away in my quiet little house, I was sitting on my back porch, a novel open in my lap, though I wasn't reading. My own untraceable phone buzzed with a single pre-arranged text message from Arthur. It contained only one word: Phoenix. I read the message and then looked out at the peaceful garden. The sun was warm on my face. The birds were singing. I thought of Simone in her store and Marcus in his bar, both of them now launching into the greatest performances of their lives. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, not even sadness. I felt only a profound and absolute stillness. Eleanor Vance was dead, and for the first time in a very long time I was free. The funeral was a masterclass in performative grief. Simone, taking charge as she always did, arranged an affair of staggering expense and ostentation. It was not a reflection of me or the life I had lived. It was a reflection of the wealth they were about to inherit. The grand old church was filled to bursting with enormous funeral arrangements of white lilies, their scent so overpoweringly sweet it was nauseating. A string quartet hired at great expense played somber classical music in the vestibule. The program was printed on thick, creamy cardstock embossed with the Vance family crest. My children stood at the entrance greeting the procession of mourners. They were the very picture of bereaved children. Simone was clad in a breathtakingly elegant black dress from a Parisian designer, a delicate black veil partially obscuring her face, which was composed in an expression of noble sorrow. Marcus wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his face pale and drawn, his hand frequently coming up to rub his tired eyes. They accepted condolences with practiced grace, sharing sanitized Hallmark card memories of me with distant relatives and my husband's business associates. She was such a force of nature, Simone would murmur, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. The world is a darker place without her, Marcus would say, his voice thick with a convincing gravelly emotion. They played their parts brilliantly. To the outside world, they were devoted children, devastated by the loss of their beloved matriarch. But I knew the truth. This was not a funeral, it was a coronation, their coronation. Every handshake, every sad smile, every shared memory was a calculated move in a public relations campaign designed to cement their status as the worthy and grieving heirs to a great fortune. Lena was there. Of course. She sat in a pew near the back, small and unobtrusive in a simple black dress. Her grief was not a performance. It was a quiet, profound, and devastating reality. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and she clutched a worn photograph of the two of us, taken years ago in the garden. Her sorrow was the only real thing in that entire cavernous church. During the reception held at the Vance mansion, I witnessed a moment that crystallized the heartless nature of my children's characters. I was not there in person, of course, but Arthur had arranged for a trusted private investigator posing as a caterer to be present and record key interactions. He recounted the scene to me later, his voice tight with disgust. Lena was standing quietly in a corner of the grand ballroom, trying to make herself invisible. Simone, holding a glass of champagne, an odd choice for a wake, but this was a celebration after all, swept over to her. "Lena," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "Thank you for your many years of service. I'm sure this must be very difficult for you." Lena simply nodded, unable to speak through her grief. "We'll be closing up the house for a while, to sort things out," Simone continued, not meeting her eyes. "So we'll be terminating your employment, effective immediately. Marcus will have a severance check for you. I'm sure you'll be able to find another position somewhere." She didn't offer a reference. She didn't ask if Lena had a place to go. She simply dismissed her 30 years of loyalty and love erased in a single cold-hearted sentence. The investigator reported that Lena just stared at Simone, her tear-filled eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound hurt. Marcus then appeared, thrusting an envelope into Lena's hand with a brisk, "Here you go." He didn't even make eye contact. They then turned and walked away, leaving Lena standing alone in the middle of the crowded room, a ghost at a feast, celebrating a death she was the only one truly mourning. Listening to the report over the phone in my quiet, sunlit house, I felt a hot, righteous anger rise in me for the first time. The plan had been about protecting a legacy, about teaching a lesson, but now it was about justice. Justice for Lena, justice for the decades of loyalty they had just spat upon. They had mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness, her loyalty for servitude. They were about to learn how devastatingly wrong they were. The funeral had been their final triumphant performance, but the final act of this play had yet to begin, and the curtain was about to rise on a scene they could never have imagined. Weeks after the spectacle of the funeral, the day finally arrived, the reading of the will. The air in Arthur Harrison's office was heavy with the scent of old leather, wood polish, and anticipation. It was a space designed to convey power and permanence, with its floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, its imposing desk and the relentless, solemn ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, counting down the seconds to my children's imagined triumph. Simone and Marcus arrived precisely on time. They were a vision of somber wealth. Simone wore a tailored black suit that probably cost more than a modest car, her grief now accessorized with a single perfect strand of pearls. Marcus looked equally sleek, his mourning attire projecting an air of sober responsibility as if he were already a captain of industry. They settled into the deep leather chairs opposite Arthur's desk, their earlier, more theatrical displays of sorrow replaced by a tense, barely concealed excitement. They tried to make small talk, their conversations circling endlessly around the estate. "The grounds alone must be worth a fortune in the current market," Marcus mused, trying to sound casual. "We'll have to get a proper appraisal of the art collection, of course," Simone added, her fingers drumming impatiently on the arm of her chair. "Some of those pieces are museum quality." They spoke as if the outcome were a foregone conclusion, as if this meeting were a mere formality, a final tedious piece of paperwork to be signed before they could begin carving up their kingdom. They leaned forward in their seats, their bodies angled toward Arthur, their eyes gleaming with a greedy, expectant light. They looked like predators poised to pounce on a long-awaited kill. Arthur, for his part, was a master of legal theater. He entered the room with a grave expression, carrying a thick leather-bound folder. He sat down behind his desk, the old chair groaning under his weight. He didn't speak immediately. He took his time, methodically putting on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses, adjusting them on his nose with a deliberate, slow movement. He opened the folder and shuffled the papers within, the crisp rustle of the parchment the only sound in the room besides the ticking clock. He was drawing out the moment, letting their anticipation build to an unbearable crescendo. I had discussed this with him. He was to be the conductor of this small private symphony of schadenfreude, and he was playing his part with relish. "Thank you both for coming," he began, his voice a low formal rumble. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of your mother Eleanor Vance." Simone inclined her head, a gesture of regal acknowledgement. Marcus simply nodded, his jaw tight with anticipation. "The document is quite comprehensive," Arthur continued, looking down at the papers. "So if you'll bear with me." He started with the preamble, the dry, legalistic language washing over them. They weren't listening to the words. They were waiting for the numbers. Their eyes were fixed on the document in his hands as if it were a treasure map, the final clue to their fortune. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder, each tick a hammer blow against the taut silence of the room. They leaned forward even further, their bodies practically vibrating with impatience and greed. The stage was set. The audience was waiting, and the final devastating act was about to begin. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence of the office. He looked over the top of his spectacles, first at Simone, then at Marcus, holding their greedy gazes for a moment before returning his attention to the document before him. "Let us begin with the minor bequests," he announced, his tone dry and methodical. This part of the proceedings was designed to be a slow burn, a gradual ratcheting up of the tension. I had left a series of small symbolic gifts to various distant relatives and old family friends. It was a way to acknowledge those who had shown me genuine kindness over the years, but it was also a delicious form of torture for my children. "To my second cousin, Margaret Jennings," Arthur read, "I bequeath the pearl necklace given to me by my mother in memory of our shared childhood summers." Simone shifted in her seat. The pearls. She had always coveted them. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by the placid mask of an heiress who could afford to be generous with trifles. "To the Phoenix Children's Hospital, a cause my late husband Robert and I supported for many years, I bequeath a one-time donation of $50,000. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. $50,000. It was a pittance in the grand scheme of things, but to him it was $50,000 that was no longer his. Arthur continued down the list. A silver tea set to an old college friend. A first edition of a beloved book to my godson. Each bequest was a small chip in the monolithic fortune they believed was theirs. And with each name read, their impatience grew more palpable. Simone's fingers were now drumming a frantic rhythm on the leather arm of her chair. Marcus was tapping his foot, a restless, jittery motion. Finally Arthur turned a page. "And now," he said, pausing for dramatic effect, "we come to the disposition of the main estate." This was it. The air in the room became thick, heavy and electric. Simone and Marcus stopped fidgeting. They went perfectly still, their bodies coiled like springs, their eyes wide and fixed on Arthur's face. The grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hold its breath. "The main estate," Arthur continued, reading slowly and deliberately, "which includes all real estate holdings, both commercial and residential, the controlling shares in the Vance construction firm, all stocks, bonds, and other securities, and the entirety of my art and jewelry collections." He paused again, letting the immense weight of that list settle in the room. He looked up from the will, making direct eye contact with my children. Their faces were luminous with triumph. Their greedy dreams now just seconds away from reality. He took a deep breath and delivered the final devastating lines. "All of which," he announced, his voice clear and strong, resonating in the silent room, "are to be transferred in their entirety into a newly formed irrevocable trust. The sole trustee and beneficiary of this trust is—" He let the name hang in the air for one perfect, agonizing second. "Miss Lena Washington." The words dropped into the profound silence of the office like stones into a deep, still well. For a moment nothing happened. The world seemed to stop. Simone and Marcus just stared, their triumphant expressions frozen on their faces, their minds refusing to process what their ears had just heard. Then, you could see the understanding dawn. Slowly and horribly, in their eyes. Disbelief. Confusion. a flicker of panicked denial, and then, finally, the full cataclysmic horror of the truth. Simone's face, so carefully composed, crumpled as if she had been struck. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her skin went from a healthy glow to a pasty, sickly white. Marcus looked as if he had been physically punched. The air knocked from his lungs, the color drained from his face, and his jaw went slack. The greedy, expectant light in their eyes was extinguished, replaced by a vast, empty black hole of shock. The fortune, the legacy, the future they had been salivating over for decades, had vanished in a single sentence. It wasn't a delay, it wasn't a complication, it was an annihilation. And it wasn't any of them. The silence that followed Arthur's announcement was not empty. It was a living, breathing entity, thick with the wreckage of shattered expectations and the deafening roar of my children's inner turmoil. The grandfather clock resumed its ticking, each second a mocking reminder of the lifetime of wealth they had just lost. Arthur, unmoved by the chaos he had just unleashed, calmly turned another page of the will. He adjusted his glasses and continued to read, his voice steady as if he were merely reciting stock figures. My mother has also left a personal letter to be read at this time, he stated, picking up a separate sheet of paper. He unfolded it and began to read my final words to them. To my children Simone and Marcus, he began, my voice channeled through his. If you are hearing this, it means my performance was a convincing one. For years I have watched you. I have listened. I have hoped. I hoped that the children I raised, the ones who knew love before they knew luxury, were still in there somewhere. But your actions and your words have shown me the truth. You have been waiting for my death, not with sorrow but with the impatience of an heir checking their stock portfolio. You see my life's work not as a legacy to be honored but as a prize to be claimed. Simone's shock was beginning to curdle into a furious sputtering rage. This is a joke, she hissed, her voice a strangled whisper. This is some kind of sick, twisted joke. Arthur ignored her and continued reading. You look at my homes and see only their resale value. You look at my art and see only auction prices. You look at me and see only an obstacle, a bank vault with a fading heartbeat. You have forgotten the most fundamental lesson of all, that wealth is not a right to be inherited, but a responsibility to be earned. Therefore I cannot in good conscience leave my fortune in your hands. She was senile. Simone suddenly shrieked, bolting upright in her chair. Her carefully constructed facade of sophistication had shattered, revealing the raw, ugly petulance beneath. She wasn't in her right mind. We'll contest this. We will drag that servant through every court in the country. Marcus, still stunned, finally found his voice. Contested on what grounds? Simone, he mumbled, his mind ever the pragmatist, already calculating the impossibility of their situation. Dr. Miller declared her fragile, not incompetent, and Arthur is the most respected estate lawyer in the state. This is ironclad. Arthur looked up from the letter, his expression one of cold professional disinterest. Your brother is correct, Miss Vance. The will is ironclad. Your mother underwent a full psychiatric evaluation with 2 independent specialists just 1 month ago. Both found her to be of exceptionally sound mind. All documents are in perfect legal order. He then returned to my letter for the final crushing blow. My fortune, he read, my words echoing in the silent room, will go to the only person who ever saw me as a human being and not a bank vault. The only person who showed me loyalty, friendship and love without condition or expectation of reward. Lena Washington has earned this legacy, not through blood, but through character. She will be a far better guardian of it than you ever could have been. Do not try to contact her. Do not try to interfere. She is protected. This is my final decision. This is my last will and testament. Arthur neatly folded the letter and placed it back in the folder. He looked at my children, his face unreadable. Furthermore, he added, his voice clipped and final, as per your mother's instructions, a restraining order has already been filed to prevent either of you from contacting or harassing Miss Washington in any way. Any attempt to do so will be met with immediate legal action. It was over. Every loophole had been closed. Every escape route had been blocked. Their power, their influence, their entire world, which had been built on the foundation of my wealth, had been reduced to ashes in the space of 10 minutes. Simone stood there, trembling, her face a mask of incandescent fury. Marcus had slumped back in his chair, a hollow, defeated man. The greedy eyes were gone, replaced by a look of utter abject despair. There were no more words. There was nothing left to say. The air was thick with their stunned, furious and absolute silence. Their future had been given to the housekeeper. It wasn't any of them, and in a quiet house, miles away, a woman they thought was dead took a sip of tea and smiled. The phoenix had risen, the scales, at long last, were balanced.